Firefighters know that every second counts during the golden hour. That is why first responders trust AMKUS for simple, rugged, reliable rescue tools.
Well, welcome to Fire Service Court Radio. This is John Murphy, retired deputy fire chief and attorney at law. And today I'm going to be doing a solo presentation on the legal issues that are affecting the fire service in 2024 and maybe give some insight on what we're going to be seeing in 2025. I'm sitting in front of this screenshot behind me because my wife is in Hawaii for Christmas and I'm here in rainy Washington. And hopefully she's having a great time with the grandkids. Had some surgeries done. I couldn't travel. And somehow it's very quiet here in my house. And so hopefully it's quiet in your house as well. So without further ado, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the issues for fire service in 2024. And hopefully we avoid the same mistakes we made this year in 2025 and to prevent litigation, create a workplace that's safe legally for your employees. And so with the thought that everybody goes home safely and wants to actually come back to work tomorrow in order to perform what has been going or what their essential job duties are. So a little sort of intro here is that, you know, there's a big nexus between the fire service and management and the firefighters on a legal basis. So there's lots of laws and lots of statutes, and even your own policies are your laws that sort of dictate sort of workplace behavior and how we deal with employees in our workplace. Unfortunately, we're finding that there's an increasing number of lawsuits coming down the pike or already have been filed or already have been settled and are sent to trial, dealing with mostly personnel issues. So Kurt Verone, who's one of the speakers or presenters here, had done some studies a few years ago, and as to the question is Mrs. Smith suing the fire department, and the reality is Mrs. Smith is not suing the fire department as much as we believe. It's our own firefighters that are suing the fire department based on discrimination, workplace harassment, and retaliation, and then just general incivility that has gone on, I think, over time. So as we sort of move through what we've seen in 2024, and hopefully we do not replicate in 2025, is we'll sort of check these little boxes off, I think, here in order to give an awareness of where we've been, the potential to where we're going as it deals with litigation in the fire service. And being an attorney, we appreciate all the litigation that goes on. But being an educator and being a former deputy fire chief and a fire chief of a small community and in the fire service for a number of years, I just hate to see the activity that goes on in the fire service with litigation that we're going to be talking about. There is a lot of material out there if you just do the research on, who's suing who, what's the basis of the lawsuits, what are the outcomes, and you'll find that the lawsuits that generally get filed are settled out of court because between the insurance companies and the member and the department, they figure that it's cheaper to settle some of these lawsuits as opposed to going to court. But if the fact patterns are sufficient and the department and the insurance company attorneys believe that we could win this, the question is, are there really winners and are there really losers? Because I think we all lose in the end for lots of different reasons. So some of them have to do with job security and continuation of a job in a department. The other is it's expensive to either defend or to prosecute a lawsuit in the organization. And so at any measure of standards of measure, it costs money to somebody. And so the department has to pay, again, to defend itself. The plaintiff has to pay to present the case and get enough, evidence in order to make the case valid. And then, is there an award at the end of the day? So we try to avoid that. And so that's what this presentation is all about. So sort of the first one is just a continuation of what we talked about. Employment law challenges. It's, like I said, it's the most prevalent, highest cost activity that we engage in the organization. And a lot of it has to do with how we deal with our employees. And a lot of the litigation that we see, or a majority of it, is that we sue ourselves. Your firefighters are suing you as the fire chief, or the department in general, for mostly discrimination, workplace harassment, which there's many subchapters to that, and retaliation. So if you file a claim against the organization or file a complaint against the organization, you're retaliated against, which in many cases is discriminatory and illegal. And so we try to avoid a lot of that with education policy. If we have an example, we try to bring that out to let people know that, even sometimes the slightest slights against someone, either by word or by action or by some under the radar sort of activity that goes on, or kind of causes people to want to correct the problem. And sometimes the only way to correct those problems is to file a lawsuit against the organization. Now, I always say that, as a fire chief and as a chief officer, we need to pay attention to what goes on in the department and respond to complaints right away. I mean, we cannot, and we've seen this many, many times, is you'll have some action going on in the organization. Somebody is offended. There's a violation of state or federal law. The person files a complaint against the department that this action is offensive, it's discriminatory, it's against the law. And the department either does nothing. They say, well, it's going to, heal itself, or they take adverse action against the person that's complaining. And so both of those actions will result in a lawsuit against your organization. And a lot of times those lawsuits have a tendency to polarize the organization, where you have somebody who's on the plaintiff side, which somebody is filing the complaint, and the other side is the defense side, where the department or that person would never do those sorts of things. And so you polarize an organization, and basically it disrupts organizational continuity and creates somewhat of a safety hazard, I think, on the emergency scene. So we need to be aware of that. Many of the lawsuits are against people of color, minorities, people that are trying to identify their gender. We're living in a fairly complex society today. The fire service has found itself as, we don't change that often. Change is tough for the fire department, right? So you have somebody come in and who may be a lesbian or gay or is in transition, and we just are like going sideways in a lot of those cases because we don't know how to deal with it. And I think that education is important, getting awareness and oriented to what's happening, educating the firefighters as to, what's going on. You don't necessarily have to name the firefighter that, like, for an example, is in transition or identified as gay or lesbian. It's just education and making our firefighters aware that we're living in a different society, and people that are coming into our fire service are not, sort of the 1950s individuals that came in, which were, pretty rigid in, the order model, order, accepting the order, carrying out the mission, those sorts of things. We have a whole different generation of people that are coming in the department that or don't think the way I do when I came into the department, and probably many of you as well. So we need to be aware of the fire department is changing. A couple of cases, I think that, if you take a look at case law and take a look at Kurt Verone's site on firelogblog.com, there's a number of cases that come out periodically dealing with gender discrimination as one of them. And so in 2023, Major Metropolitan Fire Department faced a lawsuit alleging gender discrimination in its hiring practices. Female candidates claim they were subject to more rigorous physical fitness standards than their male counterparts, which violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, emphasizing that all hiring criteria must be job-related and uniformly applied. So that case, is a reminder that when you're doing hiring, the hiring has to be like neutral as it relates to gender. So you can't provide a more strenuous test for women firefighters as you do for male firefighters, because the department philosophy is that women can't do the job. And we all know that they can do the job, and I encourage more women to apply to the fire service, but we need to make it an equitable testing process so everybody has a fair shot to get in to the fire department and perform in their lifelong passion. So the other thing that I've seen is ADA compliance. So ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which allows certain people with limitations to become a member of the fire service. And so I remember getting a call a couple of years ago from some firefighters from FDNY that said they were being what they classified as illegally passed over for the ability to get into the fire department based on a psychologist evaluation that they had PTSD. And so, over time, I think there was a lawsuit that went on. The psychologist that was doing the testing was ousted. They reevaluated all of those individuals that had PTS. And I don't know if any of them got in or all of them got in, or I'm not sure what the outcome was. But the issue was that the psychologist had a bias against military candidates because his claim was that everybody who came out of the military has PTS, and therefore you're unqualified to be a member of the organization. I think if we're going to be doing those sort of deep dive details, we need to take a look at the NFPA 1582 standard on hiring firefighters and adopt and embrace and educate your evaluators as to what the standards are under the NFPA 1582 guidelines. And so, and that kind of brings us to a point where part of that NFPA has a job analysis, the job duties, and you need to do that for your own department. Is what do your firefighters do? What are their qualifications? And can your firefighters perform the essential functions of the job, which would make them eligible for hire? And so you may have somebody that comes in with an artificial limb, like a below-the-knee amputation or missing a finger or a limb, or like an eye. And so does the NFPA standard cover those sort of eventualities where your doctor and you as the fire chief may need to make a decision on whether this particular candidate can do the essential elements of the job. And if they can, they should be eligible for hire, right? So it's an equitable situation. You don't want to get into a jam, not hiring somebody because they have, an artificial limb or they're missing a finger or something like that. And make sure that your doctor knows that we're following the NFPA standard on medical physicals for new candidates. And then the other part is the incumbent standard. So, and the incumbent standard is kind of interesting because I've consulted on a couple of cases where individual had a cardiac arrest, was resuscitated. They took him to the cath lab, ended up finding he had a couple of blocked arteries. So they put a stent in there to open up the arteries, went through cardiac rehab, met the MET standard for the treadmill. His cardiologist said he was cleared to go back to work. The fire chief said, no, he's not. He doesn't follow the NFPA standard for returning work. And what we have discovered is the fire chief was looking at the wrong part of the standard. He was looking at candidate standard, which precludes a lot of people with cardiac conditions, diabetes, hypertension, and those sorts of things. And he didn't look at the incumbent standard, which is a lot more liberal and depends a lot on the doctor that does the evaluation and the doctor's analysis. So I think at the end of the day, the firefighter got his job back, got a few dollars in his pocket for not allowing him to come back to work. And the firefighter is working fine. I mean, there's probably a lot of us out there that have medical conditions that we developed while on the job, and there's no reason why you can't come back to work with good treatment. So I think that for us, the ADA has a lot of horsepower, and the way their rules are written and our ability to come back to work or to go to work based on the ADA standards. So one of the things we're seeing as well is these sort of pre-existing, these, oh my gosh, I just had a brain fart. The presumptive illness, thanks. Thank you for whispering that in my ear. So the presumptive illness standards, one of the things that I think we have a very difficult time dealing with is if somebody files a disability claim for PTSD, there's a lot of hoops to jump through in order to get that sort of diagnosis and to be able to be accommodated for the PTSD. So that's a whole discussion by itself. I want to get, if we're going to do that, I'll get Dr. Murphy, the psychologist, former firefighter, online here, and we'll talk about PTSD standard and treatments and how firefighters can come back to work. So, but one of the cases that I want to mention is that a firefighter recovering from PTSD was terminated after requesting a modified duty schedule. The court found the department was in violation of the ADA, awarding substantial damages to the plaintiff. And when they talk about substantial, you're talking about six figures easy and maybe more. And so your department, although insurance pays for a majority of it, is not in a position to award a firefighter $1 million or more for not, allowing that person to come back to work because of, a particular medical condition that they have. So the case just mentioned underscores the importance of engaging in an interactive process with your firefighters to identify reasonable accommodations. In my work, we had an employee that had narcolepsy, which is you fall asleep during the daytime. Our reasonable accommodation was to provide nap times for the employee a couple times a day, and that was based on their schedule as when that was necessary. Our obligation was to provide time off, reasonable amount of time, of course, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and in a space that's private, so that is quiet. People aren't walking by and looking through a window and seeing the employee asleep because of her medical necessity. So just be aware that we get some unusual requests. I was teaching a class in Kansas City, and one of the fire chiefs came up and they asked about service animals. And we had a long discussion about, whether the battalion chief could bring his dog to work. And at the end of our conversation, and the end of the conversation that the fire chief had with the employee, the firefighter decided that it was too much of a burden on him to bring the dog to work, and he decided to leave his service dog at home. So, but if somebody wants to bring their dog to work and it's a valid request, the dog is trained as a service dog, then I think we need to engage in that interactive discussion as to how we can get the situation managed so everybody wins, that sort of stuff. The next area, which we are starting to see a lot more of, is liability and emergency response. Now, this deals with a couple of things. One is getting there. We're having a increase in motor vehicle accidents, apparatus rollovers, intersection collisions. Civilians are dying, not in mass quantities, but there's one civilian death as a result of sort of our action as a fire department. Weighs heavily on us as an institution and an industry. And so, one bad motor vehicle accident killing civilians reflects badly on the service as a whole. And so we need to be very careful about how we get there, and then how we return from the accident scene. Our job is to get there without creating havoc, complete our mission, EMS, fire, rescue, whatever it is, and then come returning to the fire station so everybody's safe when we get there. And so we've had a number of motor vehicle accidents last year, resulting in injuries and deaths, not only firefighters and civilians. But what we're seeing also is that firefighters aren't buckling up. And I know that there's a proponent of, get buckled up before you get in the apparatus and before it moves. And I'm wholeheartedly agreeing with that. And so before you start out keeping your seatbelt on while you're going and figuring out how to put your breathing apparatus on when you're en route, still wearing your seatbelt, because, you could have an accident at any time, is important, I think, for your survivability and preventing liability for the organization. That's only one aspect of the emergency response. We get sued sometimes for fires, EMS, rescue. So that's a department liability. And a case in 2023, fire department was sued for negligence following a large warehouse fire. The plaintiffs argued that the firefighters failed to follow standard operating procedures, resulting in preventable property damage. The court examined the department's training protocols, their SOPs, and decision-making during the incident. Although the department ultimately prevailed, this case highlighted the importance of maintaining robust SOPs and providing ongoing training to minimize liability risks. So a robust training policy, obviously, is important. I think that a documentation of the training is very important. So did you actually do the training, and can you prove it? And were the instructors certified to provide that sort of training? So if you do the 1403 live fire training, make sure your instructors are certified. If you do driver training, following whatever standard that you so choose, you want to make sure that your instructors are certified. And so your drivers have been certified by somebody who's actually qualified to provide that level of training. So the other is, I think that with the ever-changing fire loads that we're having today, and the new materials that are burning, especially the lithium-ion batteries, changes our whole protocol as to how we're going to be dealing with those fires. And I know that large cities, small cities, and towns have an issue with batteries on fire from Teslas, batteries on fire from electric bikes and motorcycles during the recharging process. And even in our own homes, we have a lot of lithium-ion batteries, especially if you have a lot of battery-powered power tools like I do. So there's always a danger of having a fire on a lithium-ion battery. I have my own philosophy on how to put those out, which I will not share here because I'm here as a lawyer, not as a firefighter. But fire departments are taking some fairly innovative steps in order to mitigate, especially large lithium-ion battery fires in occupied structures and out on the street. And I think it's important that we follow the industry standard and adopt the new technology for those particular fire events. One of the things that we're seeing also is that we enjoy qualified immunity. And so qualified immunity basically places a sort of a shield, I guess, over fire department and firefighter activities. And, every state has a qualified immunity statute in their books that says, the fire department and firefighters are generally immune from acts that aren't overtly negligent or grossly negligent. And so you do enjoy a level of immunity that not a lot of other industry has. And so I think that what we're seeing now is issues and items that our police officers are engaged in is making the legislators think about, is everything that a public safety officer does immune under the law? And they're taking a look at maybe we ought to reduce that sort of protections under qualified immunity. Qualified immunity nexus, and keeping it unless there's a clear violation of the law, they're grossly negligent and that sort of stuff. Those standards, again, they're under a microscope, and I think it's important that we conduct ourselves in a manner that doesn't call into question our veracity when it deals with taking care of events, and we remain immune to any sort of lawsuit that may occur as a result of those particular errors or oversights and even under the issues where we forgot to do something or we didn't do something. And a lot of that has to do with justification of, why did you make that decision? How did you make that decision? Under what conditions were those decisions made? Realizing what the outcome could be to let a building burn, or it's too dangerous to rescue somebody, and you put your own firefighters in harm's way. So I think that it takes a look at how we deal with the public and how the public deals with us and what the public's expectations are, which again is part of our mission statement, and is to ensure that we are serving the public in the best way we can. And if we do everything right and we can evoke the qualified immunity statutes, then I think we're going to be much safer service for your particular community. One of the cases under the qualified immunity threat, and again, 2 years ago, firefighters were accused of violating the Fourth Amendment during a forced entry. So the Fourth Amendment, remember, is the right of privacy. During a forced entry for a wellness check, the court denied qualified immunity, finding that the firefighters acted without sufficient justification. And the case illustrates the growing need for departments to ensure their actions align with constitutional protections. So I'm not really sure of all the detail. I know that as a firefighter paramedic, we did a lot of wellness checks, looking in the windows, rattling the door to try to get in for people that call and say, I haven't seen my father or father-in-law for 2 days, or haven't heard anything from him. Can you go check on him? I would suggest, and I know that you guys may already be doing this, is get the police involved. Let them make the break-in, and you follow them in. See, so the liability shifts to the police. That's some free legal advice. But anyway, you want to make sure that everything that you do is legal, and especially when you're breaking into somebody's house for a welfare check, make sure it's well documented. The source of the call is identified, and there's a real need that you go in and engage in somebody's residence. One of the final things on this sort of negligence issue for emergency responses is driver training and training in general. And I will be doing a class at FDIC on avoiding friendly fire events during training. And a lot of that has to do with the driver training part. It's a high risk activity on part of the organization, and just your general training standards. What are they? Where did you get them? Are they valid? Are you making up something that nobody ever does? We could possibly injure a firefighter, or kill a civilian, or create an ineffectual response to any type of call because our training is not adequate or sufficient in order to manage those particular calls. As you know, and some of you are training officers, recognize the fact that we can't train for everything, and so it's like we can't write a policy for everything either. So what we try to do is to, in our training standard, is to try to give them a toolkit that you can apply some esoteric training class that we had, and maybe bundle 2 or 3 training events together in order to satisfy and successfully execute a mission dealing with somebody's life-threatening situation, or a fire, or that sort of stuff. So you want to give your firefighters a big enough toolbox that they can pull out certain items, maybe 2 or 3, and then put them all together and effect a rescue or suppress a fire and those sorts of things. The other part of that is make sure that you document those training events well. Even though, I've had my firefighters go to a training instruction seminar, and they come back to the station, they go, hey, Chief, we learned this in this training session. We want to try it here. And I'm always the one to say, well, let's take a look at it, make sure it's safe enough to put into effect. Faced with the reality of an injury that we had because of that very scenario. People went to a training event, said, hey, we ought to try this. And this was a bailout drills, which we all engage in, right? So the first shot at it, we ended up dislocating a couple of shoulders, causing some rib fractures. on some of the firefighters, which took them out of commission for a while. And we found that our safety harness configuration was not right. And so, and we actually found that out because we called the instructor that said, did the training. He said, yeah, you're setting your safety points too low, and it's allowing your firefighters to drop, 2 or 3 feet, which can injure a shoulder, especially if you're using the hose to do your bailout. So we changed that particular standard. We beta tested it, and then we proceeded on a safer sort of an environment. So we need to make sure that our training is safe and we're doing everything correctly. The next area is regulatory compliance, and I know that most of you are aware that OSHA and NFPA are in this humongous rewrite for the safety standards, right? And so there's been a number of hearings on how it affects the fire department, and it's going to affect you in many ways, right? Financially, personnel-wise, equipment-wise, training-wise, everything that we do is going to be affected by the OSHA NFPA rewrites, and we need to be prepared for that. So my last reading of the rules is that they have continuing hearings about them in order to fine-tune them before they're implemented and adopted. And it pretty much affects, and for those of you who are the volunteer fire chiefs and volunteers, it affects you immensely. And there's some discussion about waiving those requirements for volunteer organizations because they're the fire department, the volunteer fire departments would possibly be unable to meet those, especially in smaller, totally volunteer departments. So if you're interested, you need to get on those committees, or you need to at least weigh in on the hearings, which I think reopened again for another review period, and get on board with what it is, how it affects you, how you need to make some changes in your organization, what policies need to be rewritten, what testing needs to be redone. I know that there's a big emphasis on medical physicals in order to maintain and create the healthy firefighter, but also how it affects our daily operations and training and our daily operations in response. One of the other parts of this is the environmental compliance and the ongoing PFAS litigation for those of us who are either affected by it or your community, which is affected by it, mostly in the drinking water, because we do training. We use the PFAS fire foam, which hopefully is all gone by now. But I remember having a conversation with Dave Dotson at one conference. He was in the Air Force, stationed probably in several secret locations, which he wouldn't tell me. But he said they used PFAS a lot. Now, firefighting foam for airplane crash fire rescues, burn pits, they were constantly exposed to it. And he said, they used to wash the fire trucks in it because they had a degreaser solvent in it. And then, they were just covered in this stuff, So Dave said, without revealing a lot, I have some health issues as a direct result of that. And so we need to be careful of that. And I think most of us know who Dave Dotson is. And so understand the risks. And so understand how you can protect yourself, and then what your department can do to protect your firefighters, and take a look for an alternative foam alternative. Another case, State Environmental Agency filed suit against several departments seeking cleanup and cost damages. And I know that we're going through that in my old department, where we used to use PFAS, on the drill ground, which was in a neighborhood. And so the water table was pretty high. And I know that we contaminated, some drinking water as a result of, we never even knew. We did not know at the time what the danger was. And now we're better educated, but we're facing, litigation as a result of things that we did 20, 25 years ago that affected the environment. So we need to make sure that we're totally aware of the chemicals that we're using. We need to be totally aware of the bunker clothing that our firefighters are wearing. We need to make sure that we decontaminate those clothing after an event to prevent cancers in our firefighters, which we're seeing an uptick because it's becoming more we're becoming more aware, and I think it's becoming more reportable that we're seeing an uptick in those sort of diseases, which are preventable. But we have to know about it. And so I think as a fire chief and as a fire officer and as a department, we need to be aware of all of the regulatory issues in play, and then the dangerous chemicals that we use to put out fires. And hopefully we don't face those sorts of things in the future. The other next thing is data security and cyber security. So data security and privacy and cybersecurity. So we're, as we morph over into more digital and AI platforms, we need to ensure that those systems are safe. You need to have a robust firewall in order to prevent, people TP creeping through your important information, and try to avoid any sort of, and I'm not sure we can do this, but any sort of ransomware demands when these hackers will freeze your data and basically put you out of business. And so, again, in 2024, ransomware attack paralyzed a large fire department dispatch and record keeping systems. Hackers demand a substantial ransom, and sensitive personnel and patient information were compromised. And the incident led to multiple lawsuits alleging negligence in cybersecurity preparedness. And then again, this case highlights the need for fire departments to invest in robust cybersecurity measures, including regular vulnerability assessments, employee training, and secure data storage. And I know that in my secondary job as a healthcare provider, we see a lot of training that comes in about how to protect PHI from people coming in through either our emails or through sort of solicitations to buy certain products. And we have classes that essentially say, if you see these emails or you get these requests, you need to report them to our cybersecurity team and make sure that there's been no incursions into our databases. And I know that schools have been shut down. I think recently, according to SeaTac Airport here in Seattle, there was a hack into their booking system, which basically shut the airport down, made it very difficult for planes to take off and land. And so, we're being invaded, I think, on the electronic level more so than ever, because there's a lot of smart people out there that have the tools and the wherewithal and the time to get into our systems, right? And the other big privacy issue is found under HIPAA, which a lot of us freaked out about when HIPAA became known in the fire service, that we had to do certain things to protect our records. And I always tell people that we've always protected patient information, the PHI, anyway. I mean, I know that back in the day, and I'll put quotations mark there, back in the day, we used to get records requests from people, and we used to keep all of our stuff in filing cabinets, right? So we get a records request like from the police department, and then we'll go through the filing cabinet, we pull out the report, we Xerox it or a copy it for them, we give them a copy of it, and everybody's, would be happy. But we can't do that. We miss the big element of, if you give protected health information to somebody else, it has to be released by the patient, right? Your department needs to have release of public information policies and forms to get filled out and reviewed by your either somebody who's assigned to do that or your department attorney, to make a decision on whether you're going to release that particular information to whoever wants it under a valid records request. Sometimes we don't give it out, right? Sometimes we redact information out of there we think may compromise a patient, and that's perfectly okay. But if you're going to be redacting material out of there, you need to huddle up with your attorney and to make sure that you're doing the right thing and you won't get, charged for violating somebody's either HIPAA rights, their PHI, information dealing with maybe social security numbers, telephones, addresses, and that sort of stuff. So you need to be right on top of all that sort of stuff when it comes to protecting information, not only for departments that collect that information, especially on EMS calls, but your own personnel, right? So we collect a lot of data on our people, and it's easily compromised if we're not prepared to prevent a lot of that sort of stuff. I talked a little bit about the use of emerging technologies, and we need to embrace that sort of stuff. And the particular focus on this one is the use of drones. And then we're seeing, if you guys are living on the East Coast, the big uptick in drone activity in New Jersey and other places. I think it's sort of this sort of H.G. Wells War of the Worlds narrative that was done on the radio in the 20s. Created pandemonium in the United States for people that were listening to that particular broadcast, thinking that we were getting invaded by aliens, and it was just a joke, right, or a prank. And so, whether the New Jersey phenomenon is a prank or a joke, or are there lots of drones out there? There probably are, but a lot of lights you see in the sky are from legitimate aircraft, taking off or landing, or other air activities in your neighborhood. So I'm not so convinced that we're being invaded by aliens, but I am convinced that we have a lot of AI and drones out there that we use in the fire industry. And so my department has a group of volunteers and paid firefighters that are qualified as licensed drone pilots. And there's a test and you have to take. And so in order to be licensed to operate a drone. And so, and drones, I think now are so invaluable that if your department doesn't have one, then you're sort of behind the curve on getting, real live overviews of what's going on the emergency. So a rescue, a fire. I heard that one department had a warehouse fire and flew a drone in the warehouse to determine the seat of the fire and the extent of the fire and those sorts of things. And that's a great use of technology. Instead of sending a firefighter in there who may be killed or injured, you're putting a piece of technology to work for you. So we need to make sure that we use that appropriately. I think some drone operators are mostly, the liability comes in again in the invasion of privacy. Where people feel that if a drone's flying past their window on their second story and they're in the bedroom, somebody's spying on them. And that's, you don't want to get caught in that sort of scenario. So the use of drones should be for emergency use or training only, and not to search your neighborhood for and to look at people in their homes or in their backyards. One of the big issues, I think, again, on the personnel side, is overtime and mandatory callback. And I know that I've gotten several phone calls, and I know that my cohorts are working with this on, do I need to take mandatory overtime and overtime? And so some departments have them in policies. Some departments under their bargaining agreements have that as a provision in their bargaining agreements, is that you shall. And it's based on lots of different factors. And so I think working with management or working through a policy on what constitutes mandatory overtime, how much mandatory overtime can I absorb, I guess, because we need time off to rest. And do I get paid for it? And that's one of the big bugaboos on, these overtime issues. So we've had some departments that don't account for the overtime correctly. Been years and years that, you're accruing hours, you're not getting paid for it. Somebody finally, the light bulb clicks on and they say, oh my God, I worked 500 hours in overtime. I haven't got paid for it. They notify the department. The department says, well, we don't have any record of that. And so we're not going to pay you. The intelligent firefighter would keep their own timesheets, especially in those overtime scenarios, and say, look, I've documented it. You owe me 500 hours overtime or more or less. And, the expectation is that you get paid. So under FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, sets those particular requirements for a 40-hour work week. We're generally work a 56-hour work week or 52-hour work week, depending on what your shifting is. And so a lot of those sort of extra hours, the extra 16 hours or 12 hours are generally exempt from overtime because they're already figured into your base wage. But if you work in excess of those hours, you need to get your overtime hours paid. And again, another legal colleague of mine does a great class on the FLSA and how it affects departments and how it affects you, especially if you're working on a job and then you go volunteer somewhere, do the same job for no money. And that's essentially under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's not a legitimate occupation. So the class goes over those sort of rules and regulations as to how does it deal with you may be volunteering in your own department after hours or going to another department doing the same job. Are you an employee, and should you be compensated for that? And the answer is it depends, right? The lawyer answer. So take the class, figure it out. The other one that drives people crazy is the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, because I think a lot of it is we don't understand how it works. Hopefully our HR person does. But there's, qualifying time. You have to work in the department for so long in order to qualify for it. And then there's certain sort of trigger points that activate your ability to get FMLA for, care of a relative or a family member, time off for your own injury or sick management. So if you have surgeries or something and you have to take a couple of weeks off, can you do it under the FMLA? And you probably can if you have enough time. So there's certain exclusions. There's certain limitations. You can't take it forever. Eventually, you're going to have to come back to work unless you retire or resign. But, it affects maternity leave. It affects paternity leave. And, how do you figure that all out? So lots of stuff online to help you figure it out. Again, a colleague teaches that class on FLSA and FMLA, and then how it affects you in your organization. So, and then a lot of times we have people get confused because the FMLA may come out of a leave bank, and so many departments have eliminated the sick leave and the vacation leave into two banks, and then they put it all into PTO or paid time off. And so how much time are you taking off for sick leave or vacation time? And the department, again, needs to do the math on that one and keep those earned time off in these sort of buckets. But all is, you may have 250 hours of time off. How much of that is sick leave? How much of that is vacation leave? And again, is it when you retire, do you get compensated for that money? So lots to think about there. And again, I think the early emergers who understand the system do better off when they're going to have to apply the system. Sort of going back again to personnel issues, the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI programs have almost left a bad taste in people's mouths because of a lot of social media pressure that, it favors one group over the other, and it makes people feel one way about another group that way or this way. And I know I'm being somewhat obscure on this, but it's I think an individual or a corporate method of making sure that people are treated equitably and equally in an organization. And there's a lot of other ways to do that sort of stuff. So of DEI, and we're seeing a lot of large corporations that are abandoning the DEI concepts, eliminating entire divisions and personnel who are their DEI managers in favor of what? And so I think even making a statement that we are hire equitably, we treat our people equitably and fairly and that sort of stuff. There's a training component to that, which I think was well handled by the DEI concept, but it's all of a sudden taken a sour turn, I think, in mainstream corporate America. So, but for the fire service, do we still teach DEI? And I think in these sort of classes that I do, I know, and my cohorts do on discrimination, workplace equity, retaliation, hostile work environment, sort of fits that sort of a slot for, we need to treat people equitably, equally, and make sure that everybody has an opportunity to come to work in your organization because they're qualified, right? They're qualified. And so one of the issues there is that, do you have adequate policies to address your discrimination problems, the harassment problems, the retaliation problems? Because we're seeing sort of an what I call incivility in an organization, which is a precursor, I think, for workplace misconduct, and could create an environment of harassment and intimidation and bullying because people just can't get along. And so my sort of advice on that is, and I say this term, and I've said it before, you want to hire right. And so people look at me like, what the heck does that mean? I said, well, you need to take a look at the entire person before you bring them into the organization. Are they a good fit? Do they have the necessary skills? Are they nice? Because, people, you can always teach people a skill set, but you can't teach people to be civil to one another. So that's a huge barrier to jump over. And how you determine that whether John Murphy is the right fit for your organization is something that management needs to take under advisement as to how do we do that sort of stuff. And it's important that we do. And if you have an event in your organization, you need to make sure that you're right on top of it, because even though we talk about let's handle this stuff at the lowest level, you need to have good policies and training in place so people can handle that at the lowest level, like even between the firefighters, but certainly amongst the fire officers and the firefighters, or amongst the fire officers themselves. But at the end of the day, the chief is responsible for what goes on in your organization. And as the chief, you need to know what's going on in your organization. And you don't want to get surprised by a lawsuit against the organization saying, I didn't know what was going on, because that's a poor excuse and a poor leadership position, that you need to know everything that goes on in your organization, especially as it deals with personnel. So you may have to be the one, standing in the way, even though your mantra is let's handle this at the lower level. Those sort of things just do not fix themselves. And so there's an undercurrent of, adversity, undercurrent of animosity, incivility, and that sort of stuff. So as a leader of your organization, you need to fix that and train your personnel through policy and training and examples of what goes on, because there's enough of those examples around the country that the department can look at and say, we don't want to conduct ourselves in this manner. And so this is what we're going to do to address that sort of stuff. One of the things that we've also seen, and I haven't mentioned this yet, is social media. And so, we have certain limitations under the First Amendment. And, one of our cohorts, Chip Comstock, is a First Amendment expert, and will tell you in no uncertain terms that, not all speech is free, and especially in the fire service, whereas a public entity, we have certain limitations that are placed on us. And there's a test that went to court called the Pickering test many years ago, sort of sets the guidelines for, what creates free speech in general population and what the limitations on free speech are under the First Amendment for public institutions. And so I always look at these sort of terminations, because if you violate, your department's policy on social media and First Amendment violations, you're going to get terminated. And so if you take a look again at Kurt's fire log blog, or just do a search on your Google, you'll see, just put in First Amendment violations, firefighter fired, and there's a long list of firefighters and EMTs and other public safety personnel that have gone down the highway because they violated their own policies and they violated, the First Amendment limitations that you have as a public servant. It doesn't mean that you've lost all your First Amendment protections, because there's enough of those out there as well. But again, you don't want to use your social media to bitch against the department. You don't want to put offensive pictures on there. You don't want to, be calling people in the community names. You don't want to be calling the mayor a name. There was a case down in I think in Oregon, at my favorite place on Cannon Beach, where the fire chief's wife was trash talking the city council, and the fire chief ended up getting fired as a result of that. So even family members are covered under this, even though you think, well, they don't work for the department. But if you're a family member in the department, your family works for the department. So word to the wise, let's not have your kids or your spouse trash talking elected officials in your organization, or you'll be looking for a new job, as we see down in Cannon Beach. That's an old case, so it's not something recent, but it's been around for a very long period of time. So I think that, if you're going to put stuff on social media, make sure it's for positive. Don't even put it on there. I mean, your social media platform is yours, of course, and you have the right to put material on there, but you have to be very, very careful about what material that you put on, especially as it deals with mentioning your department. And, we always say that, if you do have a social media site, don't identify with your organization. It's yours alone. And you don't want to be putting a whole bunch of pictures on there that you're a firefighter or an EMT, because all of a sudden you're linked to your department. So anything you say on your social media site links back to your fire department, and it may create an issue for you, especially if it's offensive, if it's accusatory, if it's racist, or you're promoting violence against a certain group of people. You're not going to be working in that department very long. And there's a number of cases out there that illustrate that. And if I wanted to talk about those cases, we'd be here all day because there's so many of them. So a word to the wise, right? And again, the group, my colleagues, do classes on First Amendment rights and social media. And if you're having a question about it, give Kurt Verone a call. I'm giving Kurt Verone more credit today than I probably ever have, but it's the holiday season, so I'm pretty generous. So they do classes, and so you can invite him and his crew to come over and do a class in your department, and I think you'll be much better off. It's a great class. I think at the end of this thing, and we're almost at an hour. And again, the fire service operates at the intersection of high-stake decision-making and legal accountability. And you may not think that you're legally accountable, but there are so many rules, federal rules, the Constitution, your state and local laws, your own policies are your laws. And so you're under a lot of obligation to make sure you follow all that sort of stuff. In 2024, certainly in 2025, things aren't going to change a lot unless we change them, right, as providers and as leaders. We got to navigate a complex array of legal challenges, right? You have a whole cadre of people who may not think the same as you and may have different ideas of what their rights and obligations are. And again, we just need to deal with the imperfectness of humans in your organization. And so the legal challenges are, again, from employment law to liability and emergency services. I didn't mention wildland fires, but we're seeing an uptick in litigation against departments for wildland fires, being not having the right resources or availability of resources. I know that the big power companies are being sued on a continual basis for starting the wildland fires especially in California and other states that have had large wildland events. People are looking to point a finger at somebody and to file a lawsuit. So we're seeing that sort of stuff, which is, again, a challenge to the organization that we need to be proactive in how we deal with those sort of situations and recognize what's upcoming for us legally and how we're going to address those particular challenges. And again, as proactivity, addressing issues, investing in training, adopting best practices, making up good policies to mitigate your risk. As Gordon Graham says, what's predictable is preventable. And so we understand what we're getting into. I mean, as leaders in the organization and as members of the organization, we're a pretty smart group of people. And so we got to understand, what our legal challenges are for 2025, learning from what we've seen in 2024. And then take a look at the journals. I mean, that we have hundreds of magazines out there dealing with fire and EMS. We have hundreds of sites out there dealing with training and education about our departments. All the major organizations, the iChief, the volunteer organization, GEMS, those, and fire engineering, of course, I want to mention you guys, have a ton of resources. And you have a ton of people that you can just pick up a phone and make a phone call, and somebody's going to help you, right? So I always offer, my services. If you have a legal question, give me a call, right? I always answer my calls, right, within 24 hours or less, and I'll get the best advice I can for you. And if I don't know what it is, I'll find somebody who does. And so, depend on your fellow firefighters for good advice. Depend on your organizations that you're hopefully a member of for resource, especially in the area of the legal and training. And so we're out there willing to help you, right? And then the other thing too is you can't learn anything better than by reading case law and case studies. Because if you take a look at maybe 15 discrimination claims, there's the similar fact patterns in there, right? A person of color, a woman, been harassed, the department's ignored the complaints. As a matter of fact, they've done either something to encourage it because you maybe don't want a particular person in your organization, so you do everything you can to get them out of there. And I can tell you that's going to bite you in the butt at the end of the day. So learn from other people's mistakes. Call us, call your organizations that you're all should be a member of to help you kind of navigate troubled waters, I think, in the fire service. Until next year, 2025, where did this year go? Be legally safe, be fire safe, take care of your health, get enough sleep, drink water, and we'll be seeing you next year. Thank you very much.
Firefighters know that every second counts during the golden hour. That is why first responders trust AMKUS for simple, rugged, reliable